Welcome back, everybody. Thank you. I hope you all had some delicious lunch, got a little sunshine, have some caffeine, because we have really some impressive ground to cover this afternoon. And we now have a series on one-on-one sessions that we are particularly looking forward to and proud of. As you all know, because most of you live in the United States or in Europe or elsewhere around the world, the Middle East just continues to defy any ability to bring peace and stability. And so we here at Aspen thought long and hard about how do we have an honest, thoughtful, nuanced conversation that doesn't disintegrate into shouting, that doesn't disintegrate into protests, and we think we have done it. So we are really looking forward to what's going to be a fantastic conversation, moderated by none other than David Ignatius, one of the great journalists in this country. And we have for you here first Salam Fayyad, who many of you will know was the former Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority. He is now a distinguished visiting scholar at Princeton University. We have Amos Yadlin, a great Israeli public servant who served as the head of military intelligence for Israel and now is the founder of MIND Israel. And then we are very grateful to have with us the National Security Advisor of the Kingdom of Bahrain, Sheikh Nasser. So, David, Salam, let me invite you to the...
So, thank you for joining us, Prime Minister. A pleasure to be. So, when I began covering the Middle East in 1980, just a shockingly long time ago, a colleague said to me, David, covering this part of the world, pessimism pays. And I am very pained to say that for much of the time, that has proved true. Not always. But we have three people who are going to speak about the Middle East who embody to me the best in values and judgment and reasons to be hopeful even in this really painful situation. As with any sensible approach, we're going to have a three-part plan. We're going to do this in segments. If we have time, I'm going to ask the audience for questions, especially our rising leaders, so be prepared. Let me begin with Prime Minister Salam Fayyad. One of the things that people say about the Palestinian problem is we need someone like Salam Fayyad, and that's often the beginning of a solution. Unfortunately, there isn't often a lot left. Prime Minister, you know that the current discussion is focused on the Biden administration's plan for a ceasefire and exchange of hostages. Brett McGurk, who might have been here with us, is, I think, on a plane to the Middle East right now. He and Director of the CIA, Bill Burns, have been back and forth tirelessly. But you have been very blunt and I would say devastating in your critique of this effort. And I'm going to read briefly from something that Salam Fayyad published in Foreign Affairs at the end of June to begin our conversation. You wrote, even if or when the guns go silent, implementing this proposal, ceasefire, phase 1, 2, and 3, will be riddled with difficulties. There is still no consensus on how to govern post-war Gaza. You went on, Hamas is not going away. When the so-called day after arrives, Hamas will still be around. And you argue in this article, as you did in Foreign Affairs back in October, right after the war started, that the PLO must admit Hamas. So I want you to, for our audience, break down the arguments that you made in that article, why you think what the administration is now trying to do is unrealistic, and what you think ought to be done instead.
Thank you very much, David, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you and to speak to the issue. First, on what I had said most recently in Foreign Affairs article was not really so much intended to be critical of the plan per se. In fact, the plan the president rolled out at the time gave us all a sense of hope that at long last, here it is the President of the United States laying out a vision for how this war can come to an end. But at the same time, I was skeptical because, to my knowledge, and that sadly remains true today, there was not adequate consideration given to what's going to happen the day after the war, the guns go silent, as I said then. That sadly remains the reality today, to the best of my knowledge. I could be wrong about that. I'm not up to date on the very latest. You reference the fact that McGurgan's on his way to the Middle East, and so are others. But at the time when the plan was rolled out, it didn't look like it was going to be adopted quickly. Hamas announced, they welcomed it. They said we were in line with this, we were okay with it, but we knew that they had issues with it at the same time. When the president rolled out the plan, he said, it's exactly an Israeli proposal. And I had my doubt, to be honest with you. And that's the reason why I was doubtful then, and I remain skeptical today, that that was not going to happen. Because subsequently, on the strength of very good and effective mediation by a number of regional partners, Qataris, the Egyptians, certainly the United States, Hamas moved from that sticking point regarding the shape of the ceasefire that they were talking about. And they became perfectly aligned with what the president announced and with what subsequently became enshrined in the UN Security Council resolution. But where we are today is the government of Israel, specifically the Prime Minister of Israel, keeps changing the goalposts, moving them. And that's where things stand, to the best of my knowledge. That needs to happen. Israel must really actually go forward and agree with the plan and adopt it, because this has become pointless and to no end, the war.
So I would just note for the audience that Ron Dermer, who's probably Prime Minister Netanyahu's closest advisor, was at the White House on Monday meeting with McGurk and Sullivan, and the White House issued a statement afterwards saying that Israel affirmed this plan. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But Salam, if I may,
sure.
The thing that surprised me most in what you wrote was your insistence that the PLO should admit Hamas as a member. I've been watching Hamas now for 25 years, and from my vantage, they brought nothing but misery to the Palestinian people. And so, you know, you're a wise man. You're to me, the leading voice of sensible Palestinian views. Why do you want Hamas in the PLO?
Hamas is a political movement and an ideology. And as such, therefore, not only was I skeptical when the war goals were pronounced the way they were by the government of Israel early on to eradicate Hamas, to destroy Hamas. You can't destroy an ideology. Much as you may wish to disagree with it, the bottom line is that this is a political movement you cannot destroy. The only way you can deal with a political ideology is to have a competitive ideology that is seen as competitive as such by the people. And when you look at the emergence of Hamas in 1987 formally, and its ascendancy, rise in polls and how it was accepted and viewed by the public, that is tied closely to the failure of the PLO, acting on behalf of all Palestinian people, back in 1993, entered into the Oslo Accords with Israel. That paradigm did not fare very well, as all of you in this room know, no doubt. And so that is basically the competition. And you combine that with the fact that the PLO, acting through the Palestinian Authority, did not always govern well, led to a situation where you had two key players. On the one hand, a partner in peace, so-called the PLO, that is actually diminishing in political standing in the eyes of the public. And on the other hand, a competing ideology that begged to differ and had the failure of the Oslo process actually to benefit from, to rise. Now, how do you deal with that? They are there, they are forced to be reckoned with. Hamas was the most significant political faction in Gaza before the war and remains so today. So unless, I mean, with all the talk about ceasefire, and it's important for this war to come to an end today before tomorrow, For all the talk about the need to secure agreement on a ceasefire, unless there is a consensus plan on what is going to happen thereafter, I do not view that effort as serious enough. Because actually, much to the chagrin of many, the day after, unless there is a consensus plan, the way I visualize it, and I hope it comes tomorrow, today, before tomorrow, is going to be dominated by a re-emergence of status quo ante in Gaza.
So one central theme for the Biden administration has been the idea that part of the day after, part of the future is what people describe as a revitalized Palestinian Authority. They even abbreviate it, the RPA. You struggled when you were prime minister to take, I'm going to be very frank here, what was regarded by Palestinians as a corrupt and inefficient governing authority and make it work better. You had some successes, but you know it better than anybody on this planet how hard it is. So how's that going to work? How are we going to get to a revitalized PA that will actually serve your people?
First of all, that is going to really take a long time. But more importantly, it's not the most critically needed element to begin the process. What is required to get this process started is political accommodation. In order to make it possible for the Palestinian Authority acting through a national consensus government, one that is not of the factions or by the factions, to show up in Gaza immediately after the guns go silent. That is why I made this proposal to expand the PLO to include all points of view represented by the full spectrum of Palestinian body politic, and Hamas certainly is a big chunk of that, but a lot of independents are there too. Many of Palestinians have become totally disillusioned with what they had agreed to, what the Palestinian leadership agreed to back in 1993. So Hamas is not alone. The reason Hamas is gaining ground is because many who are not partisan at all actually are in that space. Now, what you had said about reforming the Palestinian Authority, I mean, the last one who would really not view that as a priority is myself, for sure. I stood on that platform for a very long period of time, and I think there should be no question that it is required. It's a height of irony, sad irony, that the world decided to discover that the PA was in need of reform only after October 7th. That's a much delayed recognition of something that's obvious. One of the key reasons why the Palestinian Authority is as weak as it is today is because of poor governance. So that's absolutely essential. But it's not the first step that's required. First step is political accommodation. What I've called for is expanding the PLO so it includes everybody. And the key task of this body at this stage is to agree to a consensus government that's not of the factions or by the factions to govern both in Gaza and West Bank. And that is a tall order. It requires political accommodation, but it goes without saying that a key task of this government, in addition to dealing with the pressing issues of the day, obviously, is to reform the operations of the Palestinian Authority. That's a key requirement. Good governance is always and everywhere essential. It's critically important, tied to our ability to get to freedom and self-determination. It's that important. I believe in it. But first things first, let's get that done. And you cannot get consensus without Hamas. That's the logic behind my proposal.
So I think Israelis and Palestinians, too, would want to know, would this Hamas of the future be demilitarized so that it couldn't impose its will by force, as it did in Gaza, on the rest of the PLO?
Yeah, a point related to that is the manner in which the PLO, which for long has been considered to be partner in peace, particularly after the transformation of 1988, when the PLO, when our late chairman, President Yasser Arafat in Algiers famously made that speech saying the Palestinian National Council declares establishment of State of Palestine. That was the session for our parliament at large, signaling willingness to accept as solution to the conflict a Palestinian state on the territory Israel occupied in 1967. Subsequently, in 1993, you know what happened. There was this agreement. But that agreement was about self-rule. It was not about statehood. Statehood was not mentioned. The agreement was, I don't know if one can say, was even implicit on statehood. It was about self-rule, and all we have heard about it since then. My own experience actually would attest to that. You referred to the period of time during which I was prime minister. Yeah, we did a lot of things, and actually long before that, when I was finance minister, in terms of reforming the finance of Palestinian Authority, not many people expected that we get to the point where we got, but especially during the years when I was prime minister, when security improved vastly, and everybody would say that, the Israeli government failed to do the simplest of things that they should have done that would have imparted political credibility to what we were trying to do at the time, which was to stop military incursions in so-called Area A, meaning urban areas of West Bank. I mean, violence dropped markedly. There was 1 year when there were no casualties whatsoever after the violence of Second Intifada and all. But what happened, that simple ask, not to mention, of course, continued settlement expansion, but beyond that, that simple ask or expectation of the Israeli government to stop sending the army into the areas of West Bank where clearly there was a major turnaround in security, that was a failure. It made the whole effort look like an exercise in adapting to the reality of prolonged occupation, an acquiescence to our dreams being kind of diminished to nothing more than self-rule. That undermined us politically greatly. In terms of how the Israelis relate to us, and you said something about Hamas and all, but for those of you who are not, do not know the history that much, going back to the 80s and 70s and all, but the PLO was the arch enemy of Israel. Israel did everything it possibly could to avoid having to deal with the PLO until it decided better of it. And why is that? Because they decided that that's where the political power lay, and that that's where the arms were, and all of that sort of thing. You mentioned something about demilitarization and all of that. That comes actually with when we get to the point of discussing in a serious way statehood, that will come with it. But first things first, ceasefire and commitment to nonviolence. Commitment to nonviolence, that's critically important. And I'm not talking about commitment to nonviolence in and around Gaza only, but I'm talking about commitment to nonviolence that's comprehensive everywhere in the territories occupied in 1967 and in Israel itself. That's not a small thing to achieve. Now, building on that, if you can think of a political process that can give sense of credibility to what is being said about two-state solution and a Palestinian statehood, those issues about armament and all can be discussed. In the meantime, it's a legitimate conversation to have, for sure, but let's get the basics done.
So another area where you've been outspoken that I want our audience to think with you about is the Biden administration's effort to draw Saudi Arabia into normalization of relations with Israel and support for a peace process. And the Saudi demand has been that Israel agree to a pathway toward a two-state solution. And you've said flatly that you think that's unrealistic because the Israelis simply are not in a place where they're going to accept that. And you've described an interesting alternative to this pathway, and I'd like you to explain that for the audience. It involves prospective rights as opposed to immediate pathways.
First of all, let me actually give credit to excellent editorial work by Foreign Affairs staff because they took a word that I used in my own draft, used the word work around, and they made a subtitle out of it, and that's where that idea is embedded, as a matter of fact. So there what I had in mind was the following, and it's also related to what I thought was unrealistic at the time. We moved from a period prior to October 7, where everybody was competing for finding the right words to describe how impossible it is to get the two-state solution to see the light of day. But then all of a sudden, after October 7, everybody was talking about two-state solution as if that state of Palestine was going to come into being tomorrow. That's unrealistic. In the interim, or before that, actually before October 7, there was consideration about normalization extending to include Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis had the expectation that in order for them to get into this trilateral deal, they needed some assurance about, Palestinian statehood. Prior to October 7, the conversation was about modest things. Things like maybe, I'm not really saying Saudis themselves were asking for this, but there were think tank conversations and all about maybe, converting parts of Area B under Oslo, rural areas into Area C into Area B, and so on and so forth. Some talk about money arrangements and all of that, minimal things. But then as the war went on, the expectation was framed in the following way. What we need to see is an irreversible and irrevocable path to statehood. You stop to think about that. Is there a government in Israel today that's prepared to sign on to even a revocable and reversible path to statehood? If anything that had Palestinian statehood on it, I guarantee you, the probability of that being a starting point of conversation with the current state of Israel, the probability of that is zero. I'm not saying that that probability is going to be significantly higher than that under a different Israeli government over the foreseeable future. So if you see the world the way I see it, then you need to look for an alternative, for a workaround. And it really is basic. You can't continue to determine the speed of a caravan by the speed of the slowest camel. You need to do something about that. The current government of Israel and its successor in the immediate future, in the foreseeable future, is unlikely to really join in anything that has the promise of Palestinian statehood. And I remind everybody respectfully, Palestinian statehood was not in Oslo. A lot had to happen to invest in the goodwill that Oslo generated to convert the promised statehood into reality. None of it happened. So we need some serious work to actually fix that. So my proposal is to say, rather than think about a framework where everybody is included, including Israel, when the government of Israel is not willing to actually advance not an iota on anything that's related to Palestinian statehood. I mean, there are elements on the current Israeli government who do not wish to see the PA, the feeble PA, even continue to exist. That's a known fact. So what is the point of delaying everything until you get the government of Israel to agree to it? So my suggestion with modesty was, let's keep where the Israelis are aside, and let's ask Palestinians, seek recognition by the international community of our right, and the wording here is precise, our right to a sovereign state of Palestine on the territory Israel occupied in 1967 in its entirety, and have that enshrined in UN Security Council resolution, which means that it has to have the support of the United States, obviously, you know what I'm saying, for that to happen. It being understood that the statehood, the contours of it, the borders and everything else has to be negotiated with Israel at some point. But you can't hold the process hostage to this current government of Israel, so busy with continuing to prosecute a war to no end forever, and without really trying to do something about the political process. That would be a good starting point.
So I would just note for the audience that language is very similar to UN resolutions 242 and 338, which were the kind of foundation stones of U.S. policy on the Palestinian issue for a generation. So the idea of, once again, making that a foundation, even though at present it's not possible to move forward, has some sense to it. So I want to ask you about a more immediate worry. I had an opportunity to talk last week with King Abdullah of Jordan, and without going into what he said, I think it's fair to say that Jordanians are concerned about the possibility that as this conflict goes forward, still without a ceasefire, there could be an implosion in the West Bank. The West Bank has escaped the kind of catastrophic violence that people expected. And I want to ask you what your sense is about the political situation in the West Bank, how close it is to the kind of explosion that Jordanians fear.
I think the right to be concerned, first of all, and I remind everyone, if I may, that right before October 7. Everybody was talking about the West Bank, not Gaza. And everybody was actually worried that the situation in the West Bank was not that far from a third intifada erupting. That was the situation before. So, if anything, what happened subsequently, maybe after October 7, was that vulnerability, that risk actually has increased, has not diminished. And with each passing day, with the horror that continues to go on in Gaza, casualties and all, people who are alive for the fact that just not enough death to go around sometimes, you see it, when you see it. The pressure of it all, as a matter of fact, is not unlikely to lead to an expansion of the war and instability in the West Bank and the rest of it, the seeds of which were there even before October 7. So King is absolutely right to be worried about that situation. All the more reason why I think regional countries need to actually invest in trying to really get the process moving and finding, to me, if we really are serious about ceasefire, about bringing the war to an end, we must be serious about the governance arrangements in Gaza. There are some people who actually question this. Why are we talking about this? There is war going on. If you're serious about ceasefire, you must be thinking about the day after. Immediately now, there must be a consensus plan on what to do. So I think that's what's important. It'll be important for regional countries to get invested in that. I think that'd be hugely important.
So I have one last question, and if I can, I'm going to ask for one question from the rising leaders. But my last question, Donald Trump is going to be nominated for presidential candidate tonight at the convention. When he was president before, Trump supported, so far as I can tell, the idea that Israel should annex the West Bank. He was pushed back from that at the last minute before the Abraham Accords by the UAE. If President Trump is elected to a second term and pushes for annexation of the West Bank, what would be the consequences?
I wish we could have more time to talk about this because it's really absolutely important. First of all, you said annexation and the Trump plan of January 2020. If you all remember, that plan provided for a Palestinian state in name only, I would say, because if you really looked into the plan, there was absolutely nothing that is independent about it. It was a state of leftovers, essentially, on 70% of the West Bank, it being understood that the 30% was going to be annexed to Israel, and Prime Minister of Israel at the time wanted to rush to actually doing that. The Americans said, no, hold off. Doesn't mean annexation is not taking place. It is. Actually, not long ago, the current government of Israel, specifically the Minister of Finance, announced of Israel that they're doing all kinds of things in West Bank on settlements, 5 settlements, but most importantly, he said, actually, that construction and development in Area B, which under Oslo Accord is the purview of Palestinian Authority, is now going to be subject to approval by the government of Israel, which effectively means, rather than the redeployment and changing C into B into A, he's talking exactly the opposite. B is going to become C. So this is real and imminent danger, regardless of what happens in the United States, who is elected as President of the United States. Morally, look, I mean, people talk about the United States and its role. What do we really have to do with this and all of that? There are those who call for this engagement. The U.S. is uniquely positioned to do something about this. I think the U.S. really has a moral obligation to do something about it, particularly against the backdrop of something that could foreclose forever the possibility of a Palestinian state emerging on the territory occupied in 1967. And the best thing that the current administration can do, particularly against the backdrop of what appears to be now much talked about likelihood of change of administration, is to fence off against that arrangement by having a resolution, UN Security Council resolution, enshrine our right not to recognize Palestine. That's political fiction. Recognize our right to a sovereign state on the territory occupied by Israel in 1967, and have that enshrined in UN Security Council resolution. That's the best service the United States can do in service of its own objective, in what it saw at some point at its own national interest, to have a solution to this conflict. A state of Palestine emerged when territories occupied in 1967. Today, tomorrow, day after, but certainly while the president, under the current administration, that I view as highest priority. It's consistent also with their agenda of trying to pursue normalization and the rest of it. It fits nicely. And for those of you who actually may not know this for a fact, this may sound like asking too much. You may have implied this actually when you said this may sound like a tall order, recognition of our right to. I remind everyone that actually that's the essence of the so-called Declaration of Principles of 1993, in which the PLO, acting on behalf of all Palestinians, recognized not Israel, not Israel's existence, but Israel's right to exist in peace and security. So all I'm looking for here, if we're really serious about Palestinian statehood, is a reciprocal treatment, recognition of our right to a state on the territory of Israel occupied in 1967. That ought to be U.S. policy, especially so important if that is enshrined into international law, not in U.S. law, because you get the new administration that could reverse it. You know what I'm saying? If it is part of international law, and with all respect, I'm not talking about General Assembly, I'm talking about Security Council. This is a concrete suggestion, and I hope it will be looked into seriously.
So I think that's a good point at which to end this conversation. Forgive me for not taking questions. So it's really a pleasure to have Salam Fayyad. As everybody's heard, he's a straight talker at a time when we need that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.